The crimson sandstorm raged across the barren landscape of the planet Koresh 9, a desolate world known more for its dust-choked skies and unending dunes than for anything of value. Captain Raylan Thorne, a Terran pirate with a reputation as sharp as his wit, sat in the cockpit of his vessel, the Starfang. The ship trembled violently, its hull peppered with scars from a recent skirmish with the notorious band of Star Raiders called the Black Maw. Smoke rose from the engines, and warning lights flickered in rapid succession. "Come on, baby, hold together," Raylan muttered, his hands gripping the controls as he guided the ship through the chaotic winds. He cursed under his breath as the storm's force battered the already damaged thrusters. The hostile terrain outside offered little comfort, just an endless sea of red sand and jagged rocks. But then, as if fortune hadn't completely turned its back on him, his radar pinged a signal, an opening in the cliff face ahead, the faint outline of a cave that could provide shelter. With a grunt of effort, he redirected the Starfang toward the rocky outcrop, bringing the battered ship down in a less than graceful landing. Dust and sand billowed around the vessel, obscuring its descent until it finally came to a rest, leaning slightly to one side. Raylan ran a quick systems check. Life support stable, weapons operational, engines. Not so much. He'd need time to fix her up, and that cave was looking like the only refuge from the storm outside. Raylan threw on his rugged leather coat, slapped a breathing filter over his mouth, and armed himself with his trusty plasma pistol. As he exited the ship, the storm's roar intensified, blasting him with stinging particles of sand. His eyes narrowed against the fury of the elements, and he trudged toward the cave with the determined gait of a man who'd survived more battles than he cared to count. The entrance to the cave was partially obscured by a veil of sand, but Raylan's sharp eyes caught its outline, a shadow in the storm, dark and foreboding. He approached cautiously, every step measured, his pistol raised and ready for trouble. Pirates didn't last long in the galaxy without learning to expect an ambush in places like these. His senses heightened, and the thrum of adrenaline coursed through him as he slipped into the darkness. Inside, the roar of the storm muted to a dull rumble, the cave walls acting like a natural buffer. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he noticed something curious, a faint, unnatural glow emanating from deeper within. It was subtle, like the soft glow of bioluminescent moss, but enough to light a path through the darkened chamber. Raylan's boots crunched on the sandy floor, each step echoing off the walls, a reminder that he was far from the comfort of civilization. He moved deeper into the cave, muscles tense and senses sharp. Then he saw them, two figures huddled together against the back wall of the cavern. The sight brought him to an abrupt halt. The taller figure, a woman, had skin that shimmered with a pearlescent hue, reflecting the faint light like liquid silver under moonlight. Her eyes were unlike anything he'd ever seen, violet, luminous, and filled with a mix of defiance and vulnerability. Her hair flowed like a cascade of starlight, tendrils shimmering as they framed her face. Clutched tightly in her arms was a small girl, no older than 6, her eyes wide with fear, yet mirroring the same ethereal beauty as her mother. For a moment, time seemed to stretch thin, as if the universe itself had taken a breath to observe this encounter. Raylan stood frozen, his pulse hammering in his ears. He had crossed paths with many species in the galaxy, but this woman, with her striking features and her air of quiet strength, was something entirely different. She wasn't just an alien, she was extraordinary. "Who are you?" the woman demanded, her voice carrying an accent that hinted at far-off worlds, yet there was a steely edge to it, like a blade hidden beneath silk. Her arms tightened protectively around the child. Raylan blinked, momentarily at a loss for words, which was rare for him. He quickly gathered his composure, though, and lowered his pistol slightly, a gesture of peace but not one of trust. "Name's Raylan Thorne," he said, his tone gruff yet not unkind. "Captain of the Starfang. And who might you be, hiding in a place like this?" The woman hesitated, her gaze flicking between Raylan and the entrance of the cave as if weighing her options for escape. But then she seemed to realize that this pirate, this stranger, was the only thing standing between her and the deadly storm outside. "I am Alara," she said, finally, her voice softer now, but no less wary. "And this is my daughter, Lyra." "We mean you no harm, pirate." Raylan nodded, his sharp eyes never leaving her face. He took in their ragged clothing, the makeshift bedding of tattered blankets and the small ration packs scattered nearby. They were survivors, living on the edge, far from any civilization. The realization hit him hard. They'd been stranded here for a long time. His heart, hardened by years of piracy and betrayal, softened slightly at the sight of the child clinging to her mother. "What are you doing out here anyway?" he asked, curiosity lacing his words. "Koresh 9 ain't exactly the vacation spot of the galaxy." Alara's lips pressed into a thin line. "We had no choice. It was safer here than out there," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the world beyond the cave, where dangers far worse than the storm lay in wait. Raylan could see the fear in her eyes, but there was something else there too. A flicker of resilience, a hidden strength. Despite the alien features, she was undeniably captivating, and the protective way she held her daughter stirred something inside him he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose. "Well, Alara," he said, his voice softening as he slid his pistol back into its holster, a roguish grin tugging at the corner of his lips. "Looks like you've just found yourself some company. And lucky for you, I don't plan on leaving you two in this godforsaken place." Alara's eyes narrowed slightly, suspicious of his sudden kindness. "Why would a pirate help us?" she asked, her tone edged with both hope and doubt. Raylan shrugged, leaning casually against the cave wall. "Let's just say I've got a habit of finding lost treasures," he said with a wink, his gaze locking onto hers. "And you, Alara, look like a prize worth keeping safe." For the first time since he had laid eyes on her, a hint of a smile touched Alara's lips. A smile that, despite the circumstances, lit up the gloom of the cave like a star breaking through the darkness. And in that fleeting moment, Raylan Thorne, the pirate who thought he'd seen it all, realized that his adventure had only just begun. The muffled quiet of the cave was shattered by a sound that Raylan Thorne knew all too well. The low, mechanical hum of an approaching vessel cutting through the raging sandstorm outside. His pirate instincts screamed at him like a siren in his head. He'd been in this business long enough to recognize that sound. It wasn't just any ship. It was a hunter-class frigate, designed to scan planets for life signs and capture unregistered vessels. Whoever was on that ship wasn't here for a friendly chat. It could be rival pirates seeking revenge, slavers on the prowl for new captives, or mercenaries tracking down a valuable prize. Raylan's eyes narrowed as he turned sharply to Alara and Lyra. His voice, though calm, carried the urgency of a man who'd danced with death one too many times. "We're leaving. Now," he barked, his tone brooking no argument as he motioned for them to follow him back to the Starfang. Every second counted. If they hesitated, they'd be trapped like prey in a snare. Alara hesitated for a fraction of a second, clutching her daughter's hand tightly. "But we can't," she protested, her voice cracking under the pressure. "We've been here too long. They'll have traced my signal by now." Her face, usually composed, was now etched with panic, her gaze flicking toward the distant rumble of the approaching ship. It was as if all her fears were manifesting in that moment, materializing in the form of the enemy vessel outside. Raylan didn't flinch, his gaze locked onto hers, and for a moment everything else seemed to blur into insignificance. "I can jam the signal from my ship," he said with a confidence that brooked no argument. There was a fire in his eyes, a determination that spoke of countless close calls and escapes from the jaws of death. "Trust me, Alara, staying here isn't an option." His words seemed to reach her, breaking through her momentary paralysis. Alara's grip on Lyra tightened, but now it was with purpose rather than fear. She nodded, a silent agreement that spoke volumes. There was no time to lose. She scooped Lyra into her arms, and with a quick, decisive motion, the three of them broke into a sprint, racing through the cave's twisting passageways and out into the raging storm. Outside, the sand lashed at their faces like a swarm of angry bees, the wind howling as if trying to pull them back into the desert's clutches. The visibility was almost zero. All they could see was a swirling mass of red, but Raylan knew his ship's position by heart. He led them through the maelstrom, his free hand instinctively reaching back to make sure Alara and Lyra were still close. The child's eyes were wide with terror, but she clung to her mother, trusting in her warmth and the strange Terran man who seemed to have appeared from the storm itself to rescue them. As they neared the Starfang, the sight of the ship, a dark silhouette against the chaotic sands, was a welcome relief. Raylan activated the remote access panel on his wrist, and the ship's hatch opened with a hiss, revealing the safe haven within. Without wasting a heartbeat, he urged them inside, sealing the hatch just as the hum of the enemy vessel grew louder, too close for comfort. The moment they were on board, Raylan sprinted to the pilot's chair. His fingers danced across the console, initiating the startup sequence while his eyes flicked to the sensor readouts. "Come on, come on," he muttered under his breath as the engines roared to life. The ship's AI was already calculating the quickest route out of there, but Raylan's gut told him they needed to leave in a hurry. No calculations, no second thoughts. "Hold on to something," he shouted over his shoulder, feeling the thrum of the ship's power build beneath his feet. Alara and Lyra barely had time to strap into the seats when the Starfang launched from the ground, as blasting into the sandstorm with a surge of energy. The enemy ship was nearly on top of them now, its searchlights slicing through the darkness, but Raylan wasn't about to give them an easy target. "Engaging cloaking device," Raylan muttered, slamming his hand down on the control panel. The ship shimmered for a moment, its form bending light and radar waves around it until it vanished from sight entirely. The storm still roared outside, but within the Starfang, a tense silence settled over the cabin. Raylan's knuckles were white as he gripped the controls, eyes locked on the viewport. He could see the other ship still searching, its scanners sweeping the landscape for any sign of them. But the cloaking held, and with a deft touch, he guided the ship out of range, gliding silently through the storm like a ghost. Only when the enemy vessel was just a distant blip on the sensors did Raylan let out the breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He set the autopilot to engage a jump to Terran territory, far from the dangerous reaches of Koresh 9. The coordinates were locked in, and the engines hummed in preparation for the jump to light speed. He turned to find Alara staring out the viewport, her expression a complex mix of relief, confusion, and something else he couldn't quite decipher. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice almost too soft to hear over the hum of the engines. Her gaze was distant, her fingers still trembling slightly as she clutched Lyra close to her chest. "You didn't have to save us." Raylan paused, looking at her with an intensity that seemed to strip away the bravado he usually wore like armor. "Let's just say I have a thing for rescuing damsels in distress," he replied with a lopsided grin, though there was a sincerity in his eyes that belied his casual tone. He tried to play it off with a wink, but something in the way Alara looked at him made his words hang heavier than he intended. There was a long silence between them, punctuated only by the quiet hum of the ship's systems and the soft breathing of Lyra, who had finally relaxed enough to rest her head on her mother's shoulder. Raylan realized, in that moment, that this wasn't just another job or another rescue. He felt a connection, an unspoken bond, to these two lives that had so unexpectedly crossed into his own. Alara studied him, her eyes still glimmering with the violet light that made them seem so otherworldly. "Why are you really helping us, Raylan Thorne?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "We are strangers to you. You have no reason to risk your life for us." Raylan hesitated, his grin fading as he met her gaze with a level of honesty he wasn't used to showing. "I'm not sure," he admitted, his voice softer, almost vulnerable. "Maybe it's because I've been running my whole life, running from trouble, from enemies, from my own past. But you two, you made me feel like running wasn't the only thing I'm good at." Alara's expression softened, and for the first time a hint of a genuine smile touched her lips. It wasn't a smile of relief or gratitude, but something deeper, a silent acknowledgement that, in this vast, cold galaxy, perhaps there was still room for trust, for hope. One night, after another close call with a patrol from the Riva Syndicate, Raylan found Alara and Lyra in the galley, working together to make a meal out of the sparse rations aboard the ship. The sight was strange and beautiful. A pirate ship transformed into a place of family. Alara stood with her sleeves rolled up, a smear of flour dusting her cheek, while Lyra handed her mother ingredients, both of them giggling like it was the most natural thing in the world. Raylan paused in the doorway, taking in the scene. He felt like an intruder in his own life, watching something he wasn't sure he deserved. But when Lyra spotted him, her face broke into a wide smile, and she ran over to him, tugging at his sleeve. "Captain Raylan, come taste what we made," Lyra insisted, her eyes bright with excitement. He couldn't help but grin as he let himself be pulled into the small galley. Alara looked up at him with a smile that did something strange to his insides, like the deck shifting beneath his feet in zero gravity. She handed him a makeshift bowl filled with something that smelled surprisingly delicious. "It's not much," she said, a hint of shyness in her voice. "But it's a family recipe, or the closest I could make with what we have on board." Raylan took a bite and paused, then let out a low, appreciative hum. "Alara, if I'd known you could cook like this, I'd have kidnapped you from that planet myself," he teased, but his smile was genuine, his eyes never leaving hers. Alara laughed, a soft, musical sound that seemed to chase away all the weariness from the day. "Is that your way of saying you like it?" she asked. He nodded, pretending to consider the food seriously. "Best thing I've tasted in a long time," he said. "And believe me, that's saying something, considering the gourmet trash I usually eat on this tub." As the weeks turned into more months, the barriers that once existed between Raylan and Alara began to dissolve. Like ice melting under the warmth of a rising sun. Their conversations drifted beyond the ship's needs and technical discussions. They spoke of the worlds they'd seen, the battles they'd fought, and the secrets they kept buried in their hearts. Raylan found himself sharing stories he'd never told anyone, not even his closest crewmates. Stories of his childhood on a Terran colony ravaged by war, of the loss that drove him to the life of a pirate. Alara listened with a quiet intensity, her eyes never leaving his face. And Raylan realized that she was the first person in a long time who looked at him without judgment or expectation. One evening, they found themselves on the observation deck, a small, cramped space at the top of the ship where the stars seemed close enough to touch. The rest of the galaxy lay spread out before them like a sea of glittering diamonds. And for once, Raylan wasn't thinking about the next heist or the next escape. He was thinking about the woman beside him and the way her presence had started to feel like home. Alara stood by the viewport, her face bathed in the soft light of a distant nebula. The glow of the stars seemed to dance in her violet eyes, reflecting galaxies far away. Raylan watched her in silence, his heart beating a little too fast, a little too hard. He had seen countless wonders in the universe, but none of them had ever left him breathless like this. She turned to look at him, her expression softening when she met his gaze. "You know," he began, his voice almost a whisper, "I never thought I'd meet someone like you out here in the void. I was starting to think all the good things in the universe were just stories people told to make the darkness a little less lonely." Alara's lips curved into a gentle smile, and for the first time, Raylan saw a hint of vulnerability in her eyes, a glimpse of the woman behind the calm, collected exterior. "Nor I you, Raylan Thorne," she replied softly. Her voice was like a melody carried on the breeze, wrapping around his heart in a way he couldn't explain. She took a step closer, her fingers brushing lightly against his hand, and he felt a jolt like electricity pass between them. Raylan hesitated, for once in his life unsure of what to say. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He wasn't used to this feeling of being disarmed, laid bare without any armor to hide behind. He was a pirate, a rogue, a man who thrived on chaos and danger. But when he looked at Alara, he didn't see the darkness or the scars. He saw light. He saw a future he never thought he'd have. Alara's gaze held his, her eyes searching his face as if seeking answers to unspoken questions. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she leaned in closer. Her breath mingled with his, warm and soft, and Raylan felt his resolve crumble like stardust. All the battles, the years of living on the edge, the walls he'd built around himself, it all seemed to vanish in the space of that heartbeat. And then, as the stars swirled around them, as the universe itself seemed to hold its breath, they closed the distance between them. Their lips met in a kiss that was soft and tender, yet filled with all the unspoken words that had lingered between them. It was a kiss that carried the weight of promises, of hope, and of a future that neither of them had dared to dream of until now. For Raylan Thorne, who had once believed his fate was bound to the cold, lonely reaches of space, This moment was nothing short of a miracle. And for Alara, who had fled from everything she'd ever known, seeking refuge in the far corners of the galaxy, this kiss was beginning, an anchor that held her steady in the storm. As they finally broke apart, Raylan rested his forehead against hers, his smile softer than she had ever seen. "You know, I think you might just be the best thing I've ever stolen," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. Alara laughed softly, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Careful, Captain," she whispered back, her hand resting gently against his cheek. "You might just steal my heart, too." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and knew that his days of running, of living only for the thrill of the next score, were over. Because in this vast galaxy, in the middle of all this infinite darkness, he'd found his guiding star. And as they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, with the stars as their witnesses, the universe seemed to shift ever so slightly, like it was making room for something new, something powerful and unbreakable. A love that was born not out of destiny or chance, but out of the most unexpected collision of two souls lost in the void. Raylan Thorne had faced countless dangers in his life as a Terran pirate, ambushes by rival crews, near escapes from interstellar authorities, betrayals that cut deeper than a blade, but nothing quite prepared him for the shock that awaited him in the quiet solitude of the Starfang's communications room. He sat at the console, idly sifting through the ship's comm logs, when his eyes landed on a file that seemed out of place. A sequence of code appeared on the screen, the kind of high-level encryption used only by the galaxy's most powerful factions. His instincts flared up immediately, and he found himself decoding it almost by reflex, fingers flying over the keys with the ease of a seasoned hacker. As the encryption unraveled, a message blinked onto the screen. Raylan's breath hitched in his throat as he read the transmission's origin, marked with the unmistakable insignia of the Terran Empire. The message was addressed to Alara, but it wasn't just a standard communique. His eyes darted over the lines, absorbing the contents in mounting disbelief. The words on the screen revealed a truth that sliced through the comfortable illusions he had built around his relationship with her. Lady Alara Xandor, sister to Duke Xandor of the Terran Empire. Raylan's heartbeat pounded in his ears, drowning out everything else. He stood there, staring at the screen, as if the letters themselves were mocking him for his ignorance. Lady Alara Xandor, royalty. The sister to the Duke who had led one of the most controversial and deadly insurrections in recent galactic history. The woman he had come to trust, care for, and, if he were honest with himself, love, was not who she had claimed to be. Not even close. When he finally tore himself away from the console, it felt like he was moving in slow motion. His mind was a maelstrom of questions, doubts, and the bitter taste of betrayal. He found her in the crew quarters, her back to him, talking softly to Lyra. The sight that had once filled him with warmth now twisted a knife of betrayal deeper into his chest. He could still hear the echo of their laughter, the way they'd shared stories under the stars, the kiss that had felt like a promise, and now it all felt like a cruel joke. "Alara," he said, his voice hard and edged with a sharpness he hadn't intended. She turned slowly, her eyes meeting his, and in that instant, he knew that she knew. The truth was out, and there was no going back. "Your royalty?" he said, his voice louder now, incredulity and hurt rippling through each syllable. "Lady Alara Xandor, sister to Duke Xandor of the Terran Empire? You've been lying to me this entire time?" Alara's face paled, the color draining from her cheeks as if the words themselves had struck her like a blow. Her mouth opened and closed, as though searching for the right words that wouldn't come. The silence stretched out between them, taut and painful, before she finally spoke, her voice trembling. "I never meant to deceive you, Raylan," she said, her tone pleading, almost desperate. "Yes, I am Alara Xandor, sister to Duke Xandor. I fled when my brother's rebellion seemed lost, and I took Lyra with me to keep her safe." Raylan felt as if the floor had been ripped out from under him. All the quiet moments they had shared, the trust that had been slowly building between them, it all seemed tainted now, stained by the knowledge that she had been hiding her true identity. "But why?" he demanded, his voice raw with emotion. "Why hide from your own people? Why hide from me?" Alara looked down, her hands twisting together, her fingers pale and trembling. When she finally raised her eyes to meet his, they were filled with a deep sadness that seemed to hold the weight of galaxies. "Because I thought he failed," she said, each word heavy with regret. "I believed my brother's cause was lost, that the Terran Empire would crumble under the might of its enemies. I didn't want my daughter growing up in a world shattered by war and defeat. I thought if I could take her somewhere, anywhere, safe, we could start a new life. A life where she wouldn't have to be haunted by the shadows of a fallen empire." Raylan's jaw clenched as he listened to her words, his emotions swirling like a storm inside him. "So you ran," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You ran and hid and made a life aboard the Starfang, pretending to be someone else. All this time, I thought you were a victim, a refugee. But you were a princess in exile, a royal in hiding from a war I didn't even know was your brother's doing." Alara's face twisted with pain at his words, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I never meant for you to find out this way, Raylan," she said, stepping closer, as if reaching for some connection that was slipping from her grasp. "I didn't want to involve you in my world of politics and bloodshed. You were my escape from all of that. You were my sanctuary." Raylan flinched at the sincerity in her voice. Torn between the anger of betrayal and the raw vulnerability he saw in her eyes, he ran a hand through his hair, frustration boiling over. "Sanctuary?" he echoed bitterly. "Do you even know what it feels like to be lied to by someone you—" He stopped himself, the word catching in his throat. "Love." He couldn't say it, not now, not with the truth hanging between them like a blade. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Alara's tears finally broke free, tracing lines down her cheeks. "I was afraid, Raylan," she confessed, her voice cracking with the weight of her emotions. "Afraid that if you knew who I really was, you'd see me as a threat, or worse, an enemy. I didn't want to lose you. You were the only real thing I'd found in so long. Do you understand what that means to someone like me? For years I was nothing more than a pawn in my brother's grand game, a political tool to be used and discarded. With you, I was just Alara." Raylan's heart twisted painfully in his chest. He wanted to shout, to rage at her for deceiving him, to demand why she hadn't trusted him with the truth. But then he saw the way she held Lyra tighter, the way her voice softened when she spoke of the future she feared for her daughter. The pain in her eyes wasn't just for herself. It was for her child, for the uncertainty of a galaxy that was as ruthless as it was vast. "And what about Lyra?" he asked, his voice rougher, harsher than he intended. "What happens to her if your brother's enemies find you? What happens when they learn that the heir to the Xandor bloodline is hiding on my ship?" Alara closed her eyes, as if bracing herself against the truth of his words. "That's why I ran," she whispered, her voice almost a plea. "I had to protect her. I couldn't let her become a pawn in this war. I couldn't let her live a life dictated by my brother's ambitions or the Empire's demands. I thought if we stayed hidden, we could escape that fate." Raylan's anger deflated like a punctured balloon, replaced by a deep, aching sorrow. He wanted to stay angry, to hold on to his sense of betrayal, but all he could see was a mother's desperate love, a woman's fight to protect her child from a world that sought to consume them both. He rubbed a hand over his face, suddenly feeling older, warier than he had in years. "You should have told me, Alara," he said, his voice quieter now, but no less intense. "You should have trusted me with the truth. I've risked my life for less. I would have risked it for you and Lyra in a heartbeat, but I needed to know what I was up against." Alara reached out then, her hand trembling as she laid it on his arm. The touch was light, hesitant, like she was afraid he might pull away. "I know I hurt you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And I know it may be too late to ask, but please, Raylan, understand that every lie I told was to keep us safe. Not just Lyra and me, but you too. I was trying to protect the one person in this galaxy who made me believe that not everything is darkness and betrayal." Raylan looked down at her hand on his arm, then back into her eyes. The anger he'd felt had been real, but so was the love he still felt for her, tangled up with all the confusion and doubt. He didn't know if he could forgive her, not yet, but he also knew that he couldn't walk away. Not when the woman he had come to love stood before him, shattered and begging for his understanding. He took a deep breath, his voice rough with unresolved emotion. "I don't know where we go from here, Alara," he said honestly. "I don't know how to navigate this mess you've dropped into my lap. But what I do know is that I'm not going to let anything happen to you or Lyra. Whatever else is true, you're part of my crew now, and a captain protects his crew." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, hope flickered in Alara's eyes. She nodded slowly, her tears still glistening, but her face softening into a look of relief. "Thank you, Raylan," she whispered. "Thank you for not giving up on us." Raylan couldn't quite bring himself to smile, not yet, but he nodded in return. He wasn't sure where this revelation would lead them, what dangers lay ahead now that he knew the full truth of who she was. But as he turned back to the console and set the ship's course into the unknown, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to face the darkness alone anymore. And perhaps in the vast, cold expanse of space, that was the greatest truth of all. The air in the Starfang's cockpit was thick with tension, the kind that seemed to still even the hum of the ship's engines. Raylan Thorne paced back and forth, his mind racing as he processed the new intel he had uncovered. His eyes, usually sharp with the edge of a pirate's wit, now carried a weight that hadn't been there before. The galaxy had a way of throwing curveballs, but this one was different. This one had the power to change everything. He finally turned to Alara, who stood by the viewport, her face bathed in the soft glow of a distant star cluster. Her expression was calm, but there was a trace of unease in the way she held herself, as if she could sense that the ground was about to shift beneath her feet. Raylan opened his mouth, then closed it, unsure of how to deliver the news that was poised to shatter the fragile equilibrium they had built between them. Taking a deep breath, Raylan spoke, his voice low but steady. "You've been out here too long, Alara," he said, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "There's something you need to know. Something I found out from a transmission intercepted by our comm systems. Your brother didn't lose the war. He won. Xandor's not just Duke anymore. He's the Emperor of the Zaloran Empire." Alara's reaction was immediate and visceral. Her eyes widened in shock, and for a moment, it seemed as if she couldn't breathe. Her lips parted, but no words came out, just a strangled sound of disbelief. She stumbled backward, her hand reaching for the edge of the console to steady herself. "That's impossible," she whispered, shaking her head as if trying to dispel the information like a bad dream. "I left because he was on the verge of losing everything. I saw the rebellion crumbling with my own eyes." Raylan's lips twisted into a dry, almost bitter smile. He could see the clash of emotions playing out in her eyes, relief at the survival of her brother, fear of what his victory might mean, and the dawning horror that the empire she had run from was now more powerful than ever. "Well, things changed," he said, his voice softer now, almost gentle. "The Zaloran Empire is stronger than ever. Xandor didn't just survive the rebellion, he crushed it. And now he's not looking to lick his wounds, he's preparing to expand. They're moving against Terra." The color drained from Alara's face. She looked like she had just seen a ghost, and perhaps in a way she had. The ghost of the brother she thought she knew. The one who had become something far more formidable than she ever imagined. "Terra?" she repeated, her voice hollow, almost a whisper. "My brother is planning to attack Terra? But why? Terra never posed a threat to the Zaloran Empire. What could he possibly hope to gain?" Raylan took a step closer, his eyes locking onto hers with a seriousness that seemed to cut through the very air. "Power," he said simply. "Terra is the gateway to the Terran Quadrant, the heart of human civilization. If the Zaloran Empire controls Terra, they control the trade routes, the technology, and most importantly, they get a foothold into expanding their influence deeper into Terran space. Your brother is thinking like an emperor now, Alara. And emperors don't stop until they have it all." Alara's hands trembled as she grasped the edge of the console, her knuckles turning white. She had left the Empire to save Lyra from a future of war and devastation, believing her brother's rebellion would collapse and the Zaloran rule would be no more. Now, she was faced with the crushing realization that not only had she underestimated him, but she might have condemned the galaxy to a tyrant's reign by abandoning the fight too soon. "If you hadn't found me," she said, her voice barely audible, her violet eyes filled with a mix of guilt and dread. If we hadn't met, I would never have known. I would have let Terra fall, thinking I was protecting Lyra from a war that was already over. Raylan reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he placed it over hers. He could feel the fear and desperation pulsing through her, and for once, he didn't have a flippant remark or a sarcastic smile. "You saved us both," he said, his voice carrying the kind of conviction that comes from someone who's seen too much of the darkness in the galaxy. "In more ways than one. If I hadn't found you, I would have never known what the Xaloran Empire was planning. And Terra would have been blindsided." The realization settled between them, heavy and profound, like the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Raylan looked at Alara, really looked at her, and saw not just the woman he loved, but a key that could unlock the salvation of his people. Her presence here, on his ship, might very well be the only thing standing between Terra and its complete annihilation. Alara's eyes softened slightly, though they were still haunted by the enormity of the revelation. "You think this is fate, don't you?" she asked, her voice shaking just enough to betray the emotion she was trying to hold back. "That somehow, all of this, us meeting, me hiding on that desert planet, you stumbling across us, it's all connected?" Raylan didn't answer right away. He wasn't the kind of man to believe in fate or destiny. He was a rogue, a man who lived by chance and survival. But staring into Alara's eyes, he felt something shift in his heart, a belief that maybe, just maybe, some things were meant to happen. "Fate or not," he said finally, "I think you're here for a reason, Alara. And maybe, just maybe, you're the reason Terra still has a fighting chance." Alara's gaze turned inward, her mind racing through 1,000 scenarios, each one more dire than the last. She thought of her brother, the man who had once been her protector, the one who had held her hand through childhood nightmares, now sitting on the throne of an empire built on bloodshed and ruthlessness. The idea of standing against him, of potentially having to confront her own blood, twisted her insides into knots. "But how do I fight him?" she whispered, more to herself than to Raylan. "He's not just my brother anymore. He's the Emperor. He's the most powerful man in the Xaloran Empire. How do I even begin to stand against that?" Raylan squeezed her hand, his thumb brushing lightly over her skin, a gesture both tender and grounding. "We don't have to fight him alone," he said, his voice a low, steady promise. "We'll do it together. You and me, and Lyra, we've got the Starfang and every trick I've learned from a lifetime of running from the law and outsmarting men who thought they were untouchable. Xandor might have an empire, but we've got some he'll never understand." "And what's that?" Alara asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her gaze searching his face for an answer, for hope. Raylan's grin returned then, that familiar roguish smile that always seemed to be there even in the darkest of times. "We've got something worth fighting for," he said. "We've got each other. And that makes us more dangerous than any empire in the galaxy." The words hung in the air, and for the first time since she had learned the truth about her brother's victory, Alara felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't alone in this fight anymore. She wasn't just a pawn in her brother's game. With Raylan by her side, she was a queen on the board, ready to make her move. The silence between them was suddenly filled with unspoken promises and an unbreakable resolve. The galaxy outside might have shifted into chaos, the balance of power tilting dangerously towards tyranny. But here, in the cockpit of a pirate's ship, something new was born. An alliance forged not by politics or strategy, but by love, loyalty, and the unshakable belief that sometimes the smallest flame could start the brightest fire. As the ship's engines roared to life, pushing them toward the unknown, Raylan looked at Alara and felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose. Not just as a pirate or a captain, but as a man who had found something worth fighting for. And Alara, holding his gaze with a strength she hadn't known she possessed, knew that her place wasn't on the run anymore. Her place was here, beside the man who had saved her when she was lost, fighting to save the galaxy from the darkness her brother had unleashed. The galaxy buzzed with the news like a storm of electric energy. The story of Captain Raylan Thorne's daring rescue of Alara Xandor, spreading from star system to star system faster than light itself. In the spaceports of Terra, in the corridors of power on distant planets, and in the shadowy underbelly of pirate dens, the name Raylan Thorn was on every tongue. He was no longer just the rogue pirate with a reputation for living on the edge. He was now a hero who had single-handedly altered the course of galactic history. The revelation that Raylan had unknowingly thwarted an imminent attack on Terra stunned the galaxy. It was more than just a story of a pirate's daring. It was the tale of a man who had stumbled upon destiny and seized it. He had rescued the sister of the new emperor of the Terran Empire, defied the odds, and brought peace to the brink of a brewing war. The once rogue captain now found himself thrust into the role of diplomat, negotiator, and savior of worlds. And as the news spread, so too did the legend of Raylan Thorn, the man who had defied fate itself. Galactic leaders began to see him as more than just a pirate. They saw him as a bridge between worlds, a man who had risen from the lawless depths of the cosmos to broker an unprecedented alliance between the Terran Republic and the Terran Empire. What no one had anticipated was that this alliance would come not from treaties or battles, but from the unlikeliest of places: love. Across Terra, citizens gathered in public squares, watching holoscreens that displayed Raylan's image next to Alara Xandor's, their faces side by side, their hands clasped in a gesture of unity. Terran children played games where they pretended to be Raylan, battling invisible foes and saving entire planets, while poets and songwriters began to compose verses celebrating his exploits. He had become more than just a man. He was a symbol of hope, a testament to the idea that even the darkest past could lead to a brighter future. The day of the official alliance ceremony dawned with a sense of anticipation that rippled through the capital of Terra. The great hall of the Terran Council was filled to capacity, its vaulted ceilings adorned with banners bearing the colors of Terra and the crest of the Terran Empire. Galactic representatives from dozens of worlds were in attendance, their faces reflecting a mixture of skepticism, hope, and curiosity. They had come to witness an event that many thought impossible, a union between two powers that had once been on the brink of war. Raylan stood at the forefront of the hall, dressed not in his usual leather and utility belts, but in a formal uniform that bore the insignia of Terra. Yet, he still wore his signature grin, a reminder that no matter how much the galaxy tried to shape him, he would always be the man who walked his own path. Beside him stood Alara, regal in her bearing, her eyes shining with the same intelligence and grace that had captivated him from the moment he met her. Raylan reached out and took Alara's hand, their fingers interlocking with a natural ease that spoke of the bond they had forged in the fire of adversity. As they stood before the assembled leaders of two great civilizations, he could feel the weight of history on his shoulders, but it didn't scare him, it thrilled him. He cleared his throat, and the hall fell silent, all eyes on the man who had once been just another pirate in the vast reaches of space. "Together, we are stronger than we ever were apart," he began, his voice steady and powerful, carrying to every corner of the massive chamber. "For too long, our worlds have seen each other as enemies, threats to our existence. But today, we stand united, not by conquest or fear, but by hope and the belief that our combined strength can build a future worthy of the galaxy itself." He paused, glancing at Alara, whose eyes were glistening with unshed tears. She gave him a small nod of encouragement, and he continued, his voice gaining even more confidence. "This alliance isn't just a political move. It's the beginning of something greater, a promise to our children that they will inherit not a galaxy divided by war and hatred, but one united by purpose and peace. By uniting our worlds, we ensure not just survival, but a future where our children can thrive, where they can reach for the stars without the shadow of war hanging over them." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of approval and awe at the passion in Raylan's words. He wasn't speaking like a pirate, or even like a statesman. He was speaking like a man who had seen the darkness of the galaxy and still believed in its light. A man who had fought against fate and emerged victorious, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever dreamed of a better tomorrow. Alara stepped forward, her voice steady and clear as she addressed the crowd. "I once fled my home because I believed my brother's cause was lost," she said, her words carrying a raw honesty that silenced the hall. I thought that by hiding, I could save my daughter from a world of pain and loss. But fate had other plans for me. It led me to Raylan Thorn, a man who taught me that running isn't the answer. That sometimes the only way to protect what you love is to stand and fight for it. She turned to Raylan, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and love that seemed to illuminate her entire being. Raylan didn't just save me and Lyra. He saved Terra, and he saved the Zaloran Empire from a war it didn't need to fight. He reminded us all that the greatest weapon we have isn't our fleets or our armies, but our ability to see each other as allies, as partners, as family. The hall erupted in applause, the sound echoing off the high ceilings like a thunderstorm of hope and unity. The Zaloran delegation, led by high-ranking officials who had once viewed the Terrans as rivals, now bowed their heads in respect. For the first time in living memory, the barriers between their two civilizations seemed to crumble like dust in the cosmic wind. As the applause died down, Raylan turned back to Alara, taking both of her hands in his own. The galaxy around them seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them standing in that moment. A pirate and a princess who had defied the odds, defied the stars themselves, to create something new and lasting. He leaned in close, his voice low and filled with emotion only she could hear. "I never thought I'd find my place among the stars," he said softly, his eyes locked onto hers. "But I found it in you, Alara, not in the treasures I've chased or the battles I've won, but in you." Alara's smile was like the dawn breaking over a darkened horizon full of light and promise. "And I found mine in you, Raylan Thorn," she whispered, her voice choked with tears of joy. "You're my home among the stars, my anchor, my everything." In that moment, Raylan Thorn, the rogue who once roamed the galaxy without a purpose, knew he had found his true treasure. Not in gold or plunder, not in fame or fortune, but in love. In a woman who had changed his life and his future forever. He had found a legacy that would endure long after the stars had burned out. As Raylan Thorn and Alara Zandor stood side by side, the cameras capturing the image of their clasped hands and shared smiles, a new chapter in the galaxy's history began. It was a chapter not written by the hands of conquerors or the machinations of emperors, but by two souls who had found each other against all odds. A new treaty was signed that day, one that would reshape the galaxy's power dynamics forever. The Terran Republic and the Zaloran Empire, once bitter enemies, were now united in a partnership that promised prosperity, peace, and exploration beyond their wildest dreams. New trade routes were established, and joint research initiatives were launched to explore the farthest reaches of space. Together, they began to colonize new worlds, discovering wonders and mysteries that had once seemed beyond reach. The name Raylan Thorn became synonymous with hope. His story was taught in academies across the stars, inspiring generations of explorers, diplomats, and even future pirates who believed that even the smallest light could ignite the brightest fire. Statues were erected in his honor, both on Terra and in the Zaloran capital, depicting him standing proudly with Alara at his side, the embodiment of unity between their two worlds. And as the galaxy looked toward a future filled with endless possibilities, Raylan and Alara looked at each other, knowing that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. They had forged a bond stronger than any treaty, a love that would echo through the ages, long after the stars themselves had faded from the sky. For in the end, the greatest legacy they left was not in the treaties they signed or the wars they prevented, but in the simple truth they had discovered in each other. That love, when it is true, when it is fearless, can shape the very fabric of the universe itself.
If you like this story, please press the like button and subscribe. It encourages me to write more stories. Thank you.